Hello, welcome back to Going Walkabout. Today I start removing the authentication requirement of the application. Up until now, it was a requirement to set up a user when you first started using the application. Now this is of course a limitation, or it's a blocking thing if you just want to explore the application a little bit. So a while back I decided to remove this kind of hurdle. And I first streamlined my authentication method. So yes, sign in with Apple and also make it a little bit easier in the flow, so it's less of a restriction. But now I start working on removing the final restriction. So if you start the app, I want you to get into the app and then you can decide to authenticate or create an account later. So if you get into the app, it looks like this. So when you start up, you can see here that we have the trip view, but yeah, you cannot create a trip because you're not signed in. But you can go to the Explore tab, and in the Explore tab you see some trips. Now we already see here an issue that the preview images aren't loading. We're going to cover that in a minute. And the same for notifications. If you want to get notifications of trip you follow, etc., you need to sign in. And for your user profile, the same thing. And in the settings, we have reduced it so that you can remove the caching, you can check the version, you can check the terms of use, and this kind of thing. So things that are public, you can still access and you can go to. So let's go back to the first page and look a little bit how I actually created this, what I needed to do to make this all work. So let's dive into here. If you see here, this is the Trips Table View Controller. That's the Table View Controller, but is still a UIKit controller in this application. There's a lot of Swift UI already, but this is still one that's in UIKit, making it a little bit more tricky to adjust for this kind of scheme. So we have the Trip View Controller, and then where we fetch the data here, we're fetching the data. And here I'm just checking if I have a current user. And this current user is actually the Firebase login user. I don't have that yet because you're not authenticated and it's not set. So in the else scenario, I go here, you're not authorized, and I create this message here that you see to sign up and sign in. Now I can go into the sign in screen. What you remember from the last episode, here I can use email, password and sign in and continue with that. But we'll not demo that yet. Now this was a simple implementation. Of course I had to remove my plus button here. That's also somewhere in the application. As you see, I created an outlet here for my trip button, and here I use the authentication manager to check if you're authorized. If you're not authorized, I disable it and I create the tint color. So this way I can remove that button, so you cannot create a trip if you're not signed in. Now for other views it's a little bit easier to do. Let's go to the notifications, because here we have the notification view, what is all Swift UI, and Swift UI makes this, in my opinion, a little bit easier to do. So that's why I also was a little bit reluctant to do it now or later when I've moved more to Swift UI. But hey, I started to do it now and that's where we are. And here I have added to my view model an is authenticated flag. So if we go to the view model that I don't have here, my view model of my notifications, we have that here. You see I have my is authentication, and that just returns my authentication manager shared authorized. Now I know the authentication manager is still a singleton, it's not an observed object, and the reason is that I also use it in lower versions than iOS 13 that I still support, so that's why I implemented it like this. As soon as I drop that support for iOS 13 and lower, I will refactor this and make it an observable object so that I don't need to use a singleton, but I can slowly move it into an environment object and to deal with that. But for now, this is the way I do it. I created a published var is authenticated, that then in my view here I can say, okay, if it's authenticated, I show my whole normal, what you see here, view, but it's not authenticated. And in other situations I show my sign in message, what is just a view wrapper to do this with the correct message and go to the sign in, and that's what I have like this. To the definition. Here I created the view with the text, the button, and that does all this sign in, as you can see here, and that I can swipe that away again. So I reuse that in several places. Now for the profile it's exactly the same, there's no difference. There's the profile view where we also check here for the view model is authenticated. I also added that authenticated flag. It's the same thing. And for the settings, I had to do a little bit differently because I have my body of my settings, and if you're authenticated, I show you all the account stuff with the username, the password, the account, your connected accounts, and whether you have blocked users or not, what is a feature, what requires authentication, because I link that to you as a user. And then here the cache is always visible, and here the about section is always visible, and we of course, if you're authenticated, get the logout button in the settings. So this is always visible, and the section on top here about the account is only for authenticated user, and of course the logout button is also only for authenticated users. And now I have this whole scheme here working, what was fairly easy to do. Now I still have troubles if I navigate further, but let's go to the first issue that I'm facing here, that I don't get my images. And it took me a little bit, but I built the images, or for those that have been following this project for a long time know that I retrieve my images from an App Engine instance in the Google Cloud. That's part of the Firebase project, and I use that to retrieve my images so I can rescale them and do all the things in an easy way. Could have used Firebase functions. I chose to go the App Engine route because I'm more familiar with that and I like doing it. And I'll show you that also is a little bit of an advantage what I did. Now, I made the assumption images are only retrieved by authenticated users. Since you're not authenticated, you don't get the image. It's not even attempting to retrieve it. Let's go to my API, because everything I do with the remote goes through a single API class, and that will return me a request. And what I had to do, and initially it was only doing this. So it would get my current user, get the token. If you have a token, then it would create the request and return my URL request with the correct authentication set. And of course, I didn't have a current user, would fail, and no request was made to the backend. So I changed that a little bit. So if I have a current user, meaning I'm authenticated, then I will do that. And in the other situation, I create a new URL where I append public, and I already had that in my backend for some other purposes that I'll did on the web, and I return a non-authenticated request to this public endpoint. Now, since I'm running against my official backend, so the Google hosted backend, we don't see the images because I haven't pushed this into the demo production environment yet. So I will show you now what I had to do on my backend to make that work. And the backend here is in my node environment. I have my public URL trips, images. Yeah. Okay, let's go step back. My main, as you can see, I have my API public. That's the URL prefix I use for non-authenticated images, and I have my authenticated. And this is say it's not authenticated, so that's why it's in the routing first, and these are my authenticated. Now, if I go to this public, API public, that is where we have here, I get my public, you think in it before is the prefix API public, and then trips, trip ID image, get public image. And that get public image is what we have here. Now, what I needed to do in this scenario is I need to retrieve the image first to see if it is really a public image, and if it's an image, a trip, a public trip, and if it's a public trip, then I return the image. So what I do, I return from my trip repository my trip with the trip ID that gets passed in. If it's not null and it's shared and it's featured, then I get the trip image to return it, etc. And otherwise I just don't return anything. And I also have a normal get image that is called on the old URL, and that will get the image and return it anyway. So, but this way, if you're authenticated, you get the image, because that's an assumption I made. If you're authenticated user, you can get all images. If you're a public user, you can only get images of trips that are public. And let's now go and run this backend. So the backend is now running. Let's go back to Xcode and go into my API settings and run it against my backend, stop, and restart. So it needs to rebuild, and now it will go and retrieve images from through my local backend for testing purposes. Now, as you can see, we're back at the same sign up screen, but let's now go to the Explore tab. The Explore tab is opening, and yes, it's retrieving images. And if we look a little bit in our backend code, we also see that it retrieved the images from the API public, etc., and it returned the images. So I have also solved that problem. So what have I done? To summarize it here, I made sure you only see data if you're authenticated. I did the same for notifications and the profile. I also made sure that my Explore works. So now I could theoretically move into a trip. But that I haven't done yet. That is also going to be quite tricky because there's a lot of logic in the trip, whether you're the owner of the trip or not, etc. Because if I would open the trip right now, it will crash immediately. But that is the topic for the next video. So, as you can see, I'm working on a plan. Download the app, install it, go and explore. All works without signing up. If you like what you see, you can quickly create an account and start using your own trips and create a profile, etc., and start following others. Next episode, we'll work on making sure that you can actually see a trip, not only the thumbnail and the initial picture, but you can go into the whole trip. And then, of course, I also need to show alerts if you try to follow. Now you need to log in first, etc. So there's still quite some work to be done. But that's the next episode. For now, it's done. I'm happy. I hope you like it. If you like it, please like and subscribe. And if you really like it, also press the notification button because you get notified for the next episode. Well, thank you for watching, and I'm glad to see you in the next episode again.